The night it happened was strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you hear your own heart louder than the world around you, the kind of quiet that makes you believe the universe is holding its breath before something unspeakable unfolds. I lived alone in my small house at the edge of town, separated from my nearest neighbors by a shared wall, a thin slice of stone and wood that carried every echo from their side to mine. They were a large family, 7 sisters and their father, a stern but kind man who worked himself to the bone to keep his daughters sheltered after their mother passed years ago. I had watched them in fragments, never intrusively, but in the ordinary ways neighbors observe neighbors. The sisters hanging laundry in the backyard, their laughter spilling across the fence like sunshine, their father's wary figure returning late at night with tired steps but always with food in his hands. They were a world of their own, vibrant and fragile, and I was only the quiet man next door. But then came the night when the silence turned heavy, when the balance of their world shattered, and I realized that their grief would pour through the thin wall and into my life, whether I was ready or not. It began with a muffled thud, a sound so unnatural in the stillness that I froze mid-sentence in the book I was reading. At first I thought something had fallen, a chair, a table, maybe the clumsy cat I had seen once darting between their legs. But then came the sound that made my skin prickle, a single, sharp cry of panic. It was the eldest daughter's voice, though at the time I only knew it as the voice of the girl with solemn eyes who often stood at the doorway watching her younger sisters chase each other across the yard. The cry was followed by a flurry of footsteps, frantic, uneven, like a storm breaking inside their house. I stood, pressed my ear against the wall, and heard the chaos unfold. Voices overlapping, sobs breaking, one of the younger girls screaming, "Papa!" over and over, until her voice cracked with a kind of terror you only hear once in your life and never forget. My body moved before my mind did, carrying me out my front door and across to theirs, where the wooden door stood ajar, swinging gently as though even the house itself was gasping for air. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with panic and tears. The 7 sisters were gathered in the narrow hallway, some clutching each other, some frozen in shock, their faces pale and glistening in the dim light of a single flickering bulb. And there, lying motionless at their feet, was their father. He looked smaller than I remembered, his broad shoulders slack, his chest unmoving, his eyes closed as though he had surrendered to a sleep from which he would not wake. The eldest knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to shake life back into his body, whispering his name like a prayer. "Papa, please, please." She kept saying, her voice breaking each time. The younger girls clung to one another, their cries rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks, helpless and furious at once. I should have felt like an intruder, like an outsider stepping into a sacred moment of grief, but all I felt was the undeniable weight of their despair pulling me into its orbit. I dropped to my knees beside the eldest and tried to check for a pulse, but even before my fingers touched his skin I knew. The silence told me. The coldness told me. Death had already claimed him. When the truth settled in, a heavier silence followed, one so profound it felt like the house itself bowed its head. The girls looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, searching for something I didn't know if I had: strength, comfort, answers. I called the doctor, called the authorities, did everything that protocol demanded, but nothing changed the reality their father was gone. By dawn, the officials had left, the body had been taken, and all that remained was 7 shattered girls and a house that suddenly seemed too big, too empty, too merciless. I thought that was when I would quietly step away, return to my solitude, let their relatives or someone closer handle the aftermath. But fate, or perhaps something deeper, had other plans. For when I turned to leave, the eldest daughter caught my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair falling loose around her face, but there was a fire in her gaze that startled me. She didn't wail or beg, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a vow, a plea, and a command all at once. "Please, don't leave us." Those 4 words froze me where I stood, more binding than chains, more piercing than any cry of sorrow. Behind her, Her sisters looked at me as though I were their last anchor in a storm that had ripped their lives apart. In that moment, I felt the enormity of their loneliness, their terror of the future, and the fragile thread of hope they were clinging to. And it was me. I was the thread. I didn't know why. I didn't know how. But I couldn't pull away. That night changed everything. I returned to my house eventually, but sleep never came. I lay awake replaying the look in her eyes, the quiver in her voice, the desperate clinging of her sisters. The wall between our homes no longer felt like separation. It felt like a thin veil between their grief and my heart. Every sob that drifted through the night pressed against me until I sat up, restless, haunted, and yet undeniably drawn to them. As the dawn light spilled across the neighborhood, pale and indifferent to the suffering it illuminated, I knew I couldn't stay uninvolved. Something inside me had shifted. The man who lived alone was gone, and in his place was someone bound to a promise he hadn't spoken but had already made. And as I rose to knock on their door again, I realized that this was only the beginning of a story far larger than myself, a story written in the silence next door, where 7 sisters waited for someone to step into the void death had left behind. And though I didn't know it yet, one day the eldest would look at me again, with the same fire in her eyes, and say the words that would seal my fate forever. All 7 of us are yours. But that day was still far ahead. For now, the silence next door was calling, and I could no longer ignore it. The days that followed were blurred with grief and uncertainty, as though the house next door had sunk beneath a grey cloud that refused to move. And each time I crossed the threshold I felt as if I were stepping into another world, one heavy with silence and muffled sobs, with half-eaten meals left untouched on the table, with eyes that had forgotten how to shine. At first I told myself I was only there to check in, to see if they needed help with errands, to make sure they ate at least something. But soon my visits stretched from moments to hours, and before I realized it, I had become a constant presence in their home. The 7 sisters seemed to orbit around me, not in the way of dependency, but in the way lost travelers cluster around the faint glow of a lantern. Each girl was different, as if their father had carved 7 fragments of light into the world and given each a unique hue, but grief had dimmed them all, and I began to notice the subtle ways they coped with loss. The eldest, Liana, was the pillar, tall, steady-eyed, carrying herself with a dignity far beyond her 22 years, though the faint tremor in her hands betrayed the crushing weight of responsibility she suddenly bore. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words had the finality of stone, as though she believed her silence could shield her sisters from the storm outside. Then there was Miriam the second, softer in spirit, who tried to hold everyone together with warmth, cooking meals none of them had the appetite for, wrapping shawls around her younger sister's shoulders, though her own eyes were swollen from sleepless nights. The third, Celine, was restless and fiery, pacing the rooms like a caged bird, her anger at the unfairness of fate spilling into sharp words that she regretted the moment they left her lips, though she could not stop them. She wanted to fight someone, anyone, but there was no enemy except the silence. The fourth, Nydia, was quiet and withdrawn, clinging to her notebooks where she scribbled in frantic handwriting, trying to make sense of her pain by spilling it onto paper no one else could read. The fifth, Aya, was too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the hollow ache, and she followed me constantly, like a shadow, as if my presence anchored her in a world that suddenly felt unsafe. The sixth, Rena, sought escape in laughter that came out brittle, joking at odd times, pretending not to care, until the night I found her crying into her pillow when she thought no one was listening. And the seventh, little Hannah, barely 10, was the most fragile of all, a child with wide, confused eyes who kept asking when Papa would come back, unable to accept the permanence of death. 7 daughters, 7 different mirrors of sorrow, and in their father's absence. Each reflected back to me the same unspoken plea, do not let us fall apart. At first, I tried to keep a distance, reminding myself I was only a neighbor, but the house itself seemed to pull me deeper. The leaking faucet no one knew how to fix, the letters from creditors stacked on the table, the groceries that ran out quicker than expected because grief had left them unable to plan. I found myself repairing broken shelves, cooking meals, even helping them sort through the mountain of paperwork their father had left behind. Every task felt small, yet each was met with eyes that glimmered with a mixture of gratitude and fear, as if each act was proof they were not truly abandoned. Yet outside, the world was less kind. Whispers began to ripple through the neighborhood, murmurs about the man who spent too much time in the house of 7 daughters. Some voices carried sympathy, others suspicion, but I could feel the weight of judgment pressing against me every time I walked down the street with one of the sisters beside me. Still, I could not pull away, not when I saw the way Liana's shoulders eased for a brief moment, when I carried a heavy load she had been struggling with, or when Hannah's hand clutched mine as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the house glowed with the dim gold of lantern light, I sat with them in the living room, listening as they shared fragments of memories about their father. Mariam spoke of the nights he stayed up sewing dresses for them, because they could not afford new ones, his rough hands clumsy with thread but steady with love. Celine remembered how he used to whistle while he worked, a tune that made the air lighter even when money was scarce. Little Hannah, curled in my lap, whispered that she dreamed he was coming back, and I had no strength to tell her dreams were sometimes cruel. When the memories quieted and silence filled the room once more, Liana stood, her figure outlined against the flickering light. She looked at each of her sisters, then at me, her eyes heavy with something deeper than grief. For a long moment she said nothing, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke, her voice low but unwavering. "We have no one else. No uncles who care, no aunts who will take us in. The world will try to scatter us, to break us apart, but I will not allow it. I will not let them take my sisters from me." She turned fully to me then, and in her gaze I felt the weight of a choice I hadn't known I was making until that moment. "You've already done more for us than anyone," she continued. "You stepped in when you didn't have to. You stayed when you could have walked away, and that's why all 7 of us are yours to protect." Her words struck like thunder, not loud but undeniable, reverberating in my chest until I could hardly breathe. The younger sisters looked at me with wide, expectant eyes, as though they too had silently agreed, as though in me they saw not a neighbor, but a guardian fate had chosen. I wanted to protest, to tell them I was not strong enough, not wise enough, not prepared for such a responsibility, but the words died on my tongue. For in their eyes I saw the truth. It was not about perfection, it was about presence, about not abandoning them when the world already had. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably. The man who had once lived in solitude, who had watched their laughter from a distance, who had believed himself an outsider, was no longer separate. I was theirs, and they were mine, bound not by blood but by something perhaps even stronger. The vow of survival, of unity, of a promise spoken in the aftermath of loss. That night, as I walked back to my own house, the words echoed in my mind like a bell that could not be unrung. All 7 of us are yours to protect. And though fear coiled in my chest at the enormity of what that meant, another feeling rose above it, a fierce, unyielding resolve. I did not yet know the battles we would face, the whispers we would endure, the trials that would test us, but I knew one thing with clarity as sharp as the stars in the night sky: I would not let them fall. The days that followed were not gentle. With their father gone, the sisters had no shield from the world outside, and suddenly every crack in their fragile home seemed to widen at once. Bills piled up on the table like silent threats, the roof leaked when it rained, and distant relatives who had barely spoken to them before appeared at the door with sharp smiles and sharper intentions, circling like vultures. Some offered to help by taking 1 or 2 of the younger sisters into their homes, speaking as though the girls were belongings to be divided, not hearts that belonged together. Others whispered about selling the house, about debts unpaid, about futures that seemed to vanish before the sisters could even dream of them. And through it all, their eyes turned to me. At first I told myself I was only offering support, but each day I sank deeper, taking on burdens I hadn't imagined shouldering. I spent long nights sorting through the father's accounts, writing letters to delay payments, and finding work odd enough to cover groceries for a household of 8. I fixed broken hinges, patched walls, stood in doorways when unwelcome relatives tried to press their claims. But my greatest work was invisible, listening to the unspoken fears that spilled from the sisters one by one. Liana confessed, late at night when her sisters were asleep, that she feared becoming her father too soon, carrying a weight too heavy for her youth. Mariam, soft and kind, admitted she was terrified of failing to keep everyone's spirits alive. Celine raged against the injustice, against neighbors who gossiped and men who eyed them too long in the market, her anger barely masking her vulnerability. Nadia handed me pages torn from her notebooks, silent cries for someone to understand the words she couldn't speak aloud. Aya clung to my side, asking questions about a future I didn't know how to answer. Rena joked and laughed in daylight but cried quietly in the dark. And little Hannah, who once played with dolls and ribbons, now carried questions about death that no child should have to ask. And through it all, I found myself bound to them, not by choice but by something deeper. Their grief became my grief, their burdens became mine, and in return, I began to see glimpses of something brighter, the fragile bonds of hope growing stronger in the cracks of despair. We ate meals together, prayed together, laughed in rare, fleeting bursts that reminded us all that life still had color. Yet outside the whispers grew louder. Neighbors watched with suspicious eyes, muttering about the man who spent every day with 7 grieving daughters. Some accused me of selfish motives, others predicted scandal, and though I tried to ignore them, the weight of their judgment pressed hard. One evening, Celine burst into tears after overhearing a cruel remark at the market, and it was then I realized how deeply the world's whispers cut into their fragile hearts. That night, when the sisters gathered in the dim glow of lanterns, Liana stood once more, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Let them talk," she said. "Let them judge. They don't know us, they don't understand us. What matters is this: we are together, and we will stay together. No one will scatter us, no one will tear us apart. Not while he stands with us." Her eyes found mine, and the others followed, 7 pairs of eyes glowing with something stronger than grief. Trust. I felt their gaze like a mantle draped across my shoulders, heavy but unshakable. In that moment, I understood I was not simply helping them. I had become part of their home, their family, their fragile but unyielding world. The burdens were many, but the bonds were stronger. And though I didn't know how far this path would take me, I knew one thing for certain: I could not, and would not, let them go. Storms do not always arrive with thunder in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, hidden in the tightening of debts, in the cold knock of greedy relatives, in the way the world looks at a family too fragile to defend itself. The sisters and I had settled into a rhythm, sharing meals, patching the roof, holding onto each other's strength. But the storm was waiting, and when it broke, it came from every side at once. A notice pinned to the door warned of unpaid bills, threatening to strip away the house that was their last link to their father. Men from the village, masked in politeness, began circling, offering money or favors in exchange for promises that carried shadows. Even friends turned distant, their whispers sharp and cruel, and feeding Celine's anger until she nearly fought with a neighbor in the street. And within the house, silence became another battle. The sisters leaned on me so heavily that I sometimes felt myself breaking under the weight. There were nights when I wanted to run, to retreat into the solitude I once called peace. But each time I thought of it, I saw little Hannah's wide eyes, Aya's fragile trust, Liana's unspoken plea, and I stayed. It was Liana who reminded me of the vow. One night, with the others asleep, she whispered to me in the dark, her voice trembling but firm. "We chose you. Don't betray us." Her words struck deeper than any threat the world outside could hurl. I realized then that the storm within me, doubt, fear, weariness, was the true test. If I faltered, they would lose everything. So I stood taller, even when my strength shook. I faced the storm with them, because their trust had left me no choice. And though the world pressed harder each day, I knew that giving up was no longer an option. By now, the house no longer felt like theirs alone. It had become ours, a fragile fortress built on grief, love, and the quiet strength we shared. Each sister began to open her heart in ways I hadn't expected. Mariam admitted how she feared being forgotten, her soft kindness overlooked by the world. Celine confessed that her anger was only a shield against the emptiness inside. Nadia showed me her notebooks, pages filled with poems that bled sorrow and hope side by side. Aya clung to me like a lifeline, asking me to promise that nothing would ever tear us apart. Rena, behind her laughter, revealed the loneliness that gnawed at her when no one was watching. And little Hannah, in her trembling voice, whispered that she dreamed of her father smiling, telling her not to be afraid. But it was Leanna who carried the heaviest truth. Late one evening, she told me she had been offered money to sell the house, to scatter her sisters, to start over, and she refused. "This house is not just walls," she said. "It's our hearts. And now it's yours too." I looked at them all then, 7 hearts beating as one, fragile but unyielding. And I understood I wasn't just protecting them anymore. I belonged to them. Their pain was my pain, their hope was my hope. And in that moment, I vowed silently that nothing in this world would tear us apart. Time has a way of testing promises. The storm outside never truly passed, but together we endured it, debts paid one by one, whispers fading as people grew tired of their gossip, strength growing in the place of weakness. The sisters stood taller, laughed louder, dreamed again, and I found myself no longer a visitor, but the center of their home, a piece of their family that no force could remove. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red across the horizon, we sat together in the yard, the 7 sisters around me, their voices rising in laughter that once seemed impossible. Liana turned to me, her eyes shining not with grief but with quiet certainty. She reached for my hand, and in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "All 7 of us?" she said softly. "Herr yours forever." Her words carried the same weight they had on that first night, but now they were no longer born of desperation. They were a vow, a choice, a promise sealed by love and trust. Around her, her sisters nodded, their smiles faint but true, and I knew then that my life would never again be mine alone. The house that once echoed with sorrow now pulsed with life, with laughter, with unbreakable bonds. And as I looked at them all, I understood this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one.